Something happened in Beijing this week that the world's headlines are not telling you. Not because the journalists weren't there. They were. The cameras were rolling. The handshakes were filmed from every angle. The joint statement was released, translated, distributed across every wire service on the planet within minutes. And yet, the most important information from that summit, the information that will shape the next decade of global power, was not in any of those images. It was not in any of those paragraphs. It was in what wasn't there. When the President of the United States boards Air Force One, with his Treasury Secretary, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, and the chief executives of the most powerful corporations in the world, Nvidia, Apple, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Boeing, and flies to Beijing for a summit billed as potentially historic, the world pays attention. When that summit produces a joint statement, diplomats, analysts, and strategists around the globe read it the same way a surgeon reads a scan, not for what jumps out, for what's missing. I read that statement carefully, and what I found, or rather what I didn't find, is one of the most revealing diplomatic documents I have studied in years. I'm Dr. Margaret Sullivan, and today I'm going to take you past the ceremony, past the state dinner, past the optimistic headlines, and into the actual mechanics of what was negotiated, what was refused, and what that tells us about where the real power in the U.S.-China relationship sits right now. Because here is the truth that most coverage is burying. The United States went to Beijing in a position of structural need. China received its guests, extended every courtesy, and then gave Washington almost nothing of concrete strategic value on the issues that mattered most. That is not a diplomatic summit. That is a demonstration of who currently holds the upper hand. Stay with me, because by the time this is over, you will see this situation in a way that the mainstream narrative has completely failed to offer you. And once you understand what actually happened in Beijing, the next 6 to 12 months of global events will make a great deal more sense. Let's begin where the story actually begins, not in Beijing, not in May 2026, but in April 2025, when the Trump administration announced what it called the most sweeping tariff package in modern American history. The stated logic was straightforward. Decades of trade deficits had hollowed out American manufacturing. The United States had been sending money, jobs, and industrial capacity overseas while importing finished goods at prices that masked the true cost of that arrangement. The tariff package was designed to reverse that equation, to force a rebalancing, to bring production home, and most critically, to apply maximum economic pressure on China. At the peak of the escalation, tariffs on Chinese goods reached 145%. To understand what that number means in practice, stop thinking of it as a tariff. A 145% tariff is not a trade measure. It is a near-total embargo. It is the economic equivalent of closing the door, bolting it shut, and telling the person on the other side that you are no longer interested in doing business. That was the intended signal. The problem was the assumption embedded in that signal. The assumption, and this is the critical error, was that China in 2025 was still as dependent on the American consumer market as China had been in the 1990s. Back then, roughly 1/4 of all Chinese exports went to the United States. Cut off that access, and you held genuine leverage. The threat of losing the American market was a credible weapon because the American market was irreplaceable. That was then. Here is what happened in the years between that era and this one. Beijing understood, perhaps earlier and more clearly than Washington ever gave it credit for, that a country whose primary export destination is controlled by a strategic competitor is a country that can be economically strangled at any moment. So China spent the better part of a decade doing something that received relatively little attention in Western policy circles. It systematically rebuilt its trade architecture. The process began accelerating after the first Trump trade war in 2018. The lesson Beijing drew from that episode was simple and urgent. If the United States was willing to weaponize economic access once, it would be willing to do it again. The only rational response was to reduce the exposure. By 2025, that project was complete enough to matter enormously. The United States was no longer China's most important export destination. That distinction now belonged to ASEAN, the 10-nation bloc of Southeast Asian economies. China trades more with Southeast Asia than with America. It trades more with the broader global South than with the European Union. The economic gravity of China's commercial relationships had shifted, quietly, methodically, and with strategic intention. So when the Trump administration turned off the valve of American market access, it discovered something deeply inconvenient. The leverage it thought it held had already been made obsolete. China's response was not panic, it was precision. Beijing imposed reciprocal tariffs of its own, targeted not at American industries in the abstract, but at specific constituencies whose pain would translate into political pressure. 77% on American beef, 22% on American soybeans. These numbers are not random. They are calibrated to hit agricultural states that had voted most strongly for the administration that launched the trade war. American farmers began to feel the consequences in their profit margins. Futures markets moved. And then China played a card that Washington had long acknowledged existed, but never fully prepared to face. We need to talk about rare earths, because rare earths are the detail that explains everything about what happened in Beijing last week. Rare earth elements are a group of 17 metallic elements, names like neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, that most people have never heard and almost no one thinks about in daily life. But those elements sit inside the hardware of the modern world in ways that are both invisible and absolutely irreplaceable. They are essential components in advanced semiconductors, in the electric motors that power EVs, in wind turbines, in the guidance systems of modern military missiles, in the engines of fighter aircraft, in the precision munitions that define 21st century warfare. There is no meaningful substitute for rare earth elements in most of these applications. When engineers say they are irreplaceable, they mean it in the most literal, chemically specific sense. Now consider this. China controls approximately 60% of global rare earth mining. That figure alone would be significant, but it dramatically understates the actual strategic leverage because China also controls roughly 85% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Think carefully about what that means. Even if a country mines its own rare earth ore in Australia, in Canada, in Brazil, it typically still sends that ore to China for processing. The raw material is extracted elsewhere, but the transformation into usable industrial materials happens inside China's industrial system, which means that even a theoretically diversified mining base still runs through a Chinese choke point. You can dig the ore without China. You cannot, in most cases, use it without China. When Beijing announced export restrictions on rare earth elements and other critical minerals in the spring of 2025, the reaction from U.S. defense contractors and technology companies was immediate. And it was alarmed in a way that those industries accustomed to operating with enormous institutional confidence, are almost never alarmed. The alarm was warranted. The implications were not hypothetical, they were structural, and they were not quickly solvable. You cannot build alternative rare earth processing capacity in months. The infrastructure, the technical expertise, the supply chains, these take years to develop, even with significant government investment, which means that from the moment China imposed its export restrictions, the U.S. defense and technology sectors found themselves in a position of involuntary dependence with no short-term exit. This is the context in which the presence of those corporate executives on Air Force One must be understood. Jensen Huang of Nvidia, the company that designs the world's most advanced AI chips, a company currently valued at approximately $3.5 trillion, a company whose China revenue had collapsed to near zero following U.S. export restrictions on advanced semiconductors. Tim Cook of Apple, whose global supply chain remains, despite years of American political pressure, deeply embedded in Chinese manufacturing. Larry Fink of BlackRock, managing over $10 trillion in assets, deeply attuned to the financial consequences of prolonged economic confrontation. These men were not on that plane as observers. They were on that plane because their businesses were structurally impaired by the trade war that their own government had launched. And they needed access to China, to Chinese markets, Chinese manufacturing, Chinese supply chains, in ways that had become urgent. The message transmitted by their presence was not subtle. It was the American private sector telling the American government, we need this relationship to function, because without it, the damage to our balance sheets, our supply chains, and our long-term competitiveness is real, measurable, and growing. Now let's talk about what was actually at stake in the negotiating room. Because beneath the formalities, beneath the ceremonial dinner, and the carefully choreographed photographs, there was one central issue that drove the American delegation to Beijing more urgently than any other: the Strait of Hormuz. Picture the geography for a moment. A narrow waterway, at its tightest point just 33 kilometers wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open ocean. Approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through that corridor. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, every major Gulf producer depends on that strait to get their product to global markets. Without access to it, their oil stays in the ground. Since the escalation of U.S. military engagement with Iran in early 2025, Iranian naval forces, drone capabilities, and anti-ship missile systems have created conditions in which commercial shipping through the strait has become significantly more complicated, more dangerous, and more expensive. The practical effect on global energy markets has been severe. Oil prices have risen sharply, and energy prices do not exist in isolation. They move through an economy like a current through a network, pushing up the cost of transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and ultimately the price of nearly everything that working families buy. Inflation in the United States, already running well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, has been pushed higher. The price of gasoline, which in a country built around the automobile is not an abstraction, but a daily lived reality, has climbed to levels that are now measurably affecting consumer sentiment. And consumer sentiment affects something every politician understands intimately: approval ratings. The United States needed the strait to reopen. That was not a negotiating position. That was an economic and political necessity, with a direct line from shipping routes to pump prices to presidential polling numbers. Now here is where China's position becomes extraordinarily powerful. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China purchases approximately 80% of Iranian oil exports. The economic relationship between Beijing and Tehran is deep, structural, and from Iran's perspective, essential to its survival under sanctions. China is not merely a customer for Iranian oil, it is the customer. Without Chinese purchases, the Iranian oil sector collapses. With them, Tehran has economic oxygen. That relationship gives China something the United States cannot replicate through its own bilateral engagement with Iran: genuine structural leverage over Iranian economic decision-making. If China chose to apply meaningful pressure on Iran to change its posture in the strait, if Beijing indicated to Tehran that continued disruption of commercial shipping was creating complications in the relationship, that signal would be felt immediately and deeply. This is what the United States came to Beijing to request. not as a secondary agenda item, not as a diplomatic courtesy, as the central strategic ask of the entire summit. Trump needed Xi to use China's relationship with Iran to help solve a problem that was becoming economically and politically unsustainable. This is what was not in the joint statement. Read the document carefully, and the absence is impossible to ignore. There is no Chinese commitment to apply pressure on Iran. There is no mechanism, no timeline, no verifiable pledge, no framework for measuring progress. What Xi offered, according to Trump's own account in a post-summit interview, was an expression of goodwill, something to the effect of, "If I can be of any help, I would like to be." Think about what that sentence actually means in diplomatic terms. It is not a commitment. It contains no specificity. It establishes no obligation. It creates no accountability. It is the diplomatic equivalent of a polite gesture, warm in its surface expression, empty in its strategic content. Former State Department officials and analysts at institutions including the Council on Foreign Relations have been unambiguous in their assessment. Joint statements between major powers are not written casually. Every word is negotiated. Every inclusion reflects a deliberate choice, and every omission is equally deliberate. China chose not to commit on Hormuz. That choice was not an oversight. It was a policy decision communicated with precision through the language and the silence of the document both sides agreed to release. The second absence is equally significant. The joint statement makes no mention of China reversing or suspending its rare earth export restrictions. No timeline, no conditions, no framework, no pathway back to the supply chain access that U.S. defense contractors and technology companies urgently need. The restrictions that sent alarm through those sectors remain in place as of this moment. And then there is a third element, one that did not happen in the negotiating room, but in the hours surrounding the summit, in a sequence that felt, to those watching closely, almost deliberate in its timing. As Trump's delegation was landing in Beijing, Iran quietly granted passage permits to more than 10 Chinese shipping vessels, some of the largest oil tankers currently in operation, to transit the Strait of Hormuz, without fanfare, without announcement, without condition. The message this sent was precise and devastating from a negotiating standpoint. It told the American delegation that China did not need to pressure Iran to get Chinese ships through the strait. Iran was already granting them passage as a signal of the depth and priority of the Beijing-Tehran relationship, which meant that China's help on Hormuz, the thing Trump had flown halfway around the world to request, was something China did not need to bargain for because China already had it. The disruption to global oil prices was America's problem. Chinese oil was flowing. The strait was closed to some and open to others, and China was on the right side of that distinction. The leverage calculation had not merely shifted, it had inverted. There was a moment in Xi Jinping's opening remarks at the summit that deserves far more attention than it received in general coverage. Xi invoked the Thucydides trap. For those unfamiliar, the concept takes its name from Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian who documented the war between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BCE. His central observation, that it is the rise of a new power and the fear that rise generates in the established power that makes conflict between them more likely than not, has become one of the foundational frameworks of modern international relations theory. Harvard political scientist Graham Allison examined 16 historical cases in which a rising power challenged an established one. In 12 of those 16 cases, the outcome was war. The odds are not reassuring. When Xi Jinping, standing beside the President of the United States, chose to open their summit by invoking this framework, by asking publicly whether the two nations could transcend the Thucydides dynamic and forge a new paradigm of major power relations, it was not an academic gesture. It was not a philosophical musing. It was a calculated message delivered in the most visible possible forum, with two distinct layers that need to be read separately. The first layer carried a surface reassurance. China is naming the risk because it wants to manage it. It is extending an offer of strategic coexistence, acknowledging that conflict would be catastrophic for both sides, and signaling a preference for a relationship that avoids that outcome. The second layer carried something considerably less comfortable. By invoking the Thucydides trap, Xi was not speaking as the leader of a developing nation seeking accommodation from a dominant global power. He was speaking as the leader of a peer competitor, one that has grown powerful enough that the dynamic applies, one that is now extending a conditional offer of coexistence from a position of structural confidence. And then he named the condition. She made clear, directly and without ambiguity, that the stability of the entire U.S.-China relationship, its trade dimensions, its financial dimensions, its military dimensions, was contingent on one issue above all others: Taiwan. He stated it without diplomatic softening. If the Taiwan question is handled properly, the relationship can be stable. If it is not handled properly, the two countries risk clashes and conflicts that would put the entire relationship in jeopardy. In Chinese diplomatic language, which tends toward careful formulation and measured phrasing, this was stark. The word conflicts in that context is not rhetorical color. It is a calibrated warning, delivered at the highest possible level, in the most prominent possible setting. What it communicates is this: China is prepared to manage competition across trade, technology, and finance. It is not prepared to accept any erosion of its position on Taiwan. That question is, from Beijing's perspective, non-negotiable in the most complete sense of that word. Any American administration that treats it as a bargaining chip, as something to be traded for concessions on Hormuz, or for rare earth access, or for market openings, will find that China's cooperative instincts evaporate with remarkable speed. For an administration with a deeply transactional approach to foreign policy, one that had previously framed Taiwan's defense in terms of financial negotiation rather than strategic commitment, this warning arrived at precisely the moment when the United States was most in need of Chinese goodwill. The timing of that message was not accidental. Nothing in a summit between two nuclear powers ever is. Let me be precise about what we now know, what we can reasonably assess, and where genuine uncertainty remains, because responsible analysis requires distinguishing between facts, interpretations, and possibilities. What we know: the Beijing summit produced a joint statement with no concrete Chinese commitment on the Strait of Hormuz. No reversal of rare earth export restrictions, no mechanism for resolving the core economic tensions between the two countries, and a firm, explicit Chinese warning on Taiwan. The United States arrived at this summit having initiated a trade war that has imposed significant costs on its own consumers, corporations, agricultural sector, and supply chains. China arrived having diversified its trade relationships to the point where American market access is no longer irreplaceable, having demonstrated through its rare earth leverage that it holds strategic tools the United States cannot quickly replicate, and having established through the Tehran relationship an energy corridor that operates independently of American pressure. That is the structure of power that the Beijing summit revealed. What we can reasonably assess: this summit was not the beginning of a new U.S.-China partnership. It was a managed pause in a longer-term competition, a pause that both sides needed, but that reflects asymmetric positions of strength. The pageantry of the summit served both governments' domestic narratives. The substance, or the lack of it, served China's strategic position considerably better than it served Washington's. Three scenarios now become plausible from this moment forward. The first is managed de-escalation. Both sides use the summit as a platform to quietly reduce the most economically damaging elements of the confrontation. Tariffs are selectively reduced. Technology companies regain limited access to Chinese markets. Supply chain concerns are quietly addressed through back-channel arrangements. In exchange, the United States moderates its rhetoric on Taiwan and slows, though does not stop, its efforts to build alternative supply chains for critical minerals. The Strait of Hormuz is addressed through a separate track, quietly and without public credit for either side. This scenario is the path of least economic damage. It is also messy, partial, and deeply unsatisfying to the domestic political audiences of both governments. It requires both sides to claim a kind of victory that the actual document does not quite support, but it is, by current indicators, the most likely near-term trajectory. The second scenario is stalemate and slow drift. No concrete follow-through emerges from the summit. The goodwill expressed in Beijing evaporates in the face of domestic political pressures. Technology restrictions continue to tighten. Rare earth controls remain in place. Energy costs stay elevated as the Hormuz situation remains unresolved. Both economies slow. Inflation stays high in the United States. Political pressure intensifies on both governments, and the relationship deteriorates, not through a dramatic rupture, but through accumulated friction and eroding trust. This is not a stable equilibrium. A system under that kind of sustained pressure tends to resolve in one of two directions: a breakthrough or a breakdown. The third scenario is escalation, less likely by current analysis, but far from negligible. A provocation over Taiwan, an arms sale, a naval transit read as a deliberate challenge, an accident between forces in a contested waterway, triggers a rapid deterioration. Rare earth restrictions become permanent and comprehensive. Technology decoupling accelerates dramatically. The global economy begins fracturing into two partially incompatible supply chain ecosystems, each centered on one of the two great powers. This is the scenario that keeps serious analysts awake at night, not because it is the most probable outcome, but because the institutional mechanisms that might prevent it, the diplomatic channels, the military hotlines, the working-level contacts that manage misunderstandings before they become crises, are currently weaker than at any point in the past 3 decades. The margin for error is narrower than most people realize, and the cost of an error at this level of confrontation is not measured in diplomatic embarrassment. It is measured in economic disruption on a global scale, potentially worse. Here is what I want to make sure you understand before we conclude, because this is the part that connects the geopolitics to your life in concrete, measurable ways. For most of the period between roughly 1990 and 2015, China performed a specific and enormously valuable function in the global economy. It exported deflation. It manufactured goods, clothing, electronics, appliances, tools, furniture, at a price point that kept inflation suppressed in the United States, even as the costs of housing, healthcare, and education climbed to historically unprecedented levels. Working families in America effectively received a subsidy from Chinese manufacturing. The trade relationship was contested and complicated, and its costs to American industrial workers were real and significant. But its benefit to American consumers was equally real. Low prices at the store offset, at least partially, the wage stagnation that had become structural in large parts of the American economy. The trade war has begun to reverse that dynamic. When tariffs at 145% effectively close the Chinese import channel, the deflationary pressure that kept prices low disappears. American consumers face higher prices for manufactured goods, prices that reflect the actual cost of production in higher wage environments, or the logistical complexity of rerouting supply chains through third countries, or simply the reduced competition that comes from excluding the world's most efficient manufacturer from your market. That is not a political judgment. It is an economic mechanism. And it is a mechanism that the Beijing summit did nothing to resolve. If the confrontation continues at its current intensity or escalates, the cost of living consequences for working families will be significant and lasting. They will be felt in the price of electronics, in the cost of clothing, in the expense of appliances, in the availability of goods that have become quietly dependent on Chinese manufacturing in ways that most consumers never think about. The question of whether the United States and China find a path toward managed de-escalation is not, in other words, an abstract geopolitical question. It is a question about the price of groceries, about the cost of filling a gas tank, about the purchasing power of a paycheck, about the economic reality that millions of families navigate every month. That connection between grand strategy and daily life is precisely what mainstream coverage tends to obscure by framing this as a story about presidents and summits and joint statements. It is all of those things. But it is also a story about the structural conditions that determine whether inflation rises or falls, whether supply chains function or fracture, whether the global economy continues to operate as an integrated system or begins dividing into competing blocks. The Beijing summit was a moment in that larger story. And what the moment revealed is that the story is considerably more complicated and the American position considerably more constrained than the official narrative suggests. Let me bring this to a close with 3 things I want you to hold on to. 3 analytical anchors that will help you interpret everything that follows from this summit in the weeks and months ahead. First, this summit happened because the United States needed it more than China did. That asymmetry is not a detail. It is the entire frame through which every outcome must be understood. The party that requests the meeting is the party that needs it more. Washington requested, Beijing hosted, and the joint statement reflects that power differential with remarkable precision, if you know what to look for.